All right, so I want to take you to the book of Ruth. And I am delighted to do that because this particular book is set at the time of the Confederacy. I'm not talking like big dresses and, oh, Brit. No, not that Confederacy. Now, this is, in essence, this is a play. It's funny for us because up to this point, we've done some narrative biographies, but this is actually a play. It actually plays out in 4 acts that end up being funny enough, the 4 chapters. It ends up being 4 acts of a single theme. The timing is the time of the book of Judges. Now, I want to walk through the 4 acts of it and see if I can't break it down for you. But the actual central subject is as simple as covenant love. It's a whole story of God's covenant love. It's an illustration of something, but it's also a literal story. It also, in my view, really happened, okay? And I want you to see that in Act 1, curtain rises. And with this curtain, what we have is what I would call the pain of covenant love. That's chapter 1. The pain of covenant love. To define the pain of covenant love, let me just say it's the emptying of my hands. Let me suggest something to you. Some of you really think you want the will of God, but your hands are so full of what you already have, He can't get you to His will until He empties your hands. Your schedule's so full of you, He doesn't have any space in it. So He's got to empty your schedule. So sometimes He'll do that by moving in, and then we can look at the way we respond to pain. Take a look at the beginning. It says, it came about in the days when judges governed. Well, that tells us exactly when. So we can put this somewhere around between 1300 and 1100 BC. And there was a famine in the land. Now, do you remember that there are 3 reigns in Israel? There's the former reign, the reigns, and the latter reigns. Former reigns start now. You have in October and November, former rains. Those are early rains. The early rains come to break up the soil, okay? If you don't get early rains, when you get the main rains, which are January, February, you'll get too much too fast, and the seed will run right off the land and you won't get any crops. A famine comes when you don't get early and latter rains, you only get rains. So, October, November's early rains. January, February, sometimes into December, but December is usually dry. January, February is rains, and into March, April is latter rains. Latter rains is used by the prophets to talk about the end times, but we'll deal with that later. Yeah?
What was the years?
1300 to 1100 would be a rough estimate of where you could put this. And sometime during that time, there was a time when the rains came too much too fast and the soil got washed off, and so they had a famine. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah, went to sojourn into the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was My God is King. El, God, E, my God, Melech, King. My God is King. Or, God rules, or God is awesome, or I don't know, however you want to say it. But my God is King. And the name of his wife was Pleasant One, Naomi. Naamah is pleasant. In technical terms, it's I am pleasant, but she's not. Anyway, and the names of her 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, wasting and puny. Ephrathites of Bethlehem of Judah. Ephrathites is Ephrat, is the area of fruitful place around Bethlehem. It's like a county name. They're not from the tribe of Ephrat. There is no tribe of Ephrat. Ephrathites means people from the fruitful place or the bountiful place of Bethlehem and Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And My God is King, Pleasant's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. Should they have done this? No, this was an improper thing to do. But remember, this is the time of the judges, when every man does that which is right in his own eyes. There's no singular leader, no singular court, no singular voice of God to the people. you got to remember, people aren't walking around with a hot copy of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in their back pocket. Nobody's minted them off of a printing press yet. So there's a vague memory of some laws, and they sort of do some things and keep Sabbath maybe, and that's as good as it gets. So this is an example of how quickly the memory of God's law faded in the people. Okay? And it says, they took, one's name was Orpah. That's the girl from which Oprah's name was misspelled on her birth certificate, and which is why she's called Oprah. Orpah, and the name of the other was Reut, which is the word that means friend. We don't know if it was her name or if it's resupplied back because she becomes the prototypical friend of friends, okay? But they lived there about 10 years. Now both Mahlon and Chilion died. With names like Wasting and Puny, what did you think was going to happen? Apparently they were sickly. I mean, seriously, who names their kid Wasting? You know? The woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. What does that, in verse 5, according to the law then, what is her position? They own a farm back in Bethlehem under the name of Elimelech, and he is now dead. She can return to the farm, but what can she not do? She can't sell it, nor can she raise crops and sell the crops. Okay? She doesn't really have a lot of latitude here because there's no male heir. You know Proverbs 31, she can slice, dice, buy and sell real estate if she has a male heir, but without a male heir, she's dead in the water. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return to the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now here's what I want you to see. The setting is in the first half of verse 1. But when you go to the second half of verse 1 all the way to verse 5, look at how God moved in. Okay? In verses 1 and 2, God might take from your life things. She lost her farm. In verses 3 and 4, God might take from your life people. She lost her husband. She lost her sons. In verse 5, God might take from your life wealth and security. Look at what we're saying. We're saying that in order for God to put in play what he wanted to do in her life, he had to remove from her things that she cared about, people that she loved, and wealth and security that she cherished. All those things God took. If you sign on to the God of the Bible, you are signing on that God has the right to move the furniture off the deck chairs of your cruise ship, and he can empty you out and sink the boat if he wants. Now, that's not the message that televangelists tell you, but that's the one that's in the Bible. And it's not easy to stomach that God might remove from my hands somebody that I love. When you get to verses 6 to 22, the first 5 verses are about how God moves in. The rest of the verses are about how you respond. Now look at the response in verses 6 to 22. You get down to 6. She arose, she took her daughters-in-law. Verse 7, she departed with them. Verse 8, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go return each of you to your mother's house. You know what I find? I find that when we are in pain, when God moves out of our life things that we cherish, very often we look past what he left. Partly, I think she was letting them go because she was going back to Judah and she knew that they shouldn't be in her life to begin with. I mean, let's face it. Who wants to move back into Bethlehem and say, here are my 2 daughters from the Moabites? Probably not her. I don't know why it is, guys. I don't know why it is, but when we are hurting, we tend to look at what we've lost and not look at what we still have. And what she saw was right past the girls that God left in her life. This is what I lost. The second thing I want you to do is understand that in addition to looking past God's gifts, is that one of the things we do is we push away the very people who are there to help us. Look at what happens in 8. May the Lord deal kindly with you, second half of 8, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept. Apparently, they really loved their mother-in-law. And they said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb so that they may be your husbands? She's fixed on one thing. I have no inheritance and no place for you. I can't give you anything. Now here's the thing. Does she need people that love her to cry with? Yes. But she's dismissing out of her life the last people that are a piece of the pain she's been through. And that is exactly what we do when we go through pain. We start dissing all the people that want to help, or attacking the people that are still in our life. And what's interesting is, if you go on, we also believe God's not looking out for our best interest. See, we start believing God has turned against me. Why? Because my life, my physical life, isn't going well. Who doesn't understand this? The people that you love die, you lose your stuff. You know, at some point, don't you think Job wanted to look up and go, all right, I get it already, I'm slime. What do you want from me? He didn't, but I think it would be normal to do. Look at what it says, verse 13. I don't have anything. She said, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Do you see it? God doesn't care about me. Run, don't walk to the nearest exit. You don't want to be near me. I bring the plague. God doesn't love me anymore. You sort of see that once we start believing God's not looking out for our best interests, we're going to be walking headlong into sin. It's interesting, verse 14 says, they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. There it is. Ruth's not letting her go. So Orpah goes back. Verse 15, then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Now look at the end. And your God, my God. Don't ask me to go back to the gods of my people. I want your God, your people. I want you. Can you hear how bitter Naomi is sounding? And Ruth is standing right there. Look at verse 17. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, or worse, if anything but death parts you and me. You have a friend like that? You have somebody in your life that's like that? I got to tell you something. That's worth more than gold. And she's an idiot to get rid of somebody who says, no, I'm standing with you it's you and me to the end, kid. There's something really good happening here, but Naomi doesn't see it. Because when you're hurt, all you see is what's wrong. The blood of your own pain covers all the good gifts you have. Look at verse 18. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. There's no encouragement from Naomi, none. She said, leave, 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 leave. Ruth said, I'm not leaving. I'm going to die with you. I'm clinging to you. You aren't getting away from me. I love you. I'm staying right here. No response. Crickets. Okay? But she says, all right, she's not going to leave, so I'm not going to say anything. Look at verse 19. They both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this my sweetness? She said, do not call me my sweetness. Call me Mara, call me bitterness. For the Lord Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Can anybody tell me what Ruth felt like? I don't have anything. My whole world has come apart. What is she, chopped liver? We talking spam here? What is this? Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? Can you hear bitterness dripping? Is that what happened? Did God take Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion because he wanted to strip her down, because he wanted to be angry with her? Did he take away her farm in a famine because he wanted to just be vengeful? No. The problem is the pain of covenant love. Before God can put you on the path he wants you on, he's got to get you off the path you want to be on. And sometimes corrective paths are tough. So let's put it in real terms. I mean, for most of you, it's going to be hard to talk about a husband or a wife and 2 kids. So let's just put it in order for God to get you to the right guy, ladies, sometimes he's got to get you to break up with the one you got. In order for him to get you to the right gal, gentlemen, he might make her turn on you or run off with somebody else, and you're just stunned and devastated. So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So we know that when they're arriving, they're coming in, and by now the time, or by the way, bread in this time was mostly barley bread. Wheat was only something wealthy people had. So barley bread was the average bread of the day. And when you're trying to set the story, it starts in a barley harvest, which is an autumn harvest, and it starts on that for a reason.
What do you refer to by covenant love?
The covenant love is love that is yielded in a love that will not let me go. It's a love that's pictured in chapter 1 by who? The story I just told you, Ruth is the one who brings the picture, but she's not the one in the end who closes the picture. Covenant love appears when heartbreak appears, because that's the first time you know somebody won't let you go. I was talking with a parent the other day who has been through the bitter road of a child who is addicted. And if you know what that's about, you know that it's many turns in a road that's very, very tough to navigate. You don't know when you're enabling and helping. You don't know when you're putting the brakes on appropriately. And they understand this. Because you raise your child, listen, you rock that baby and you think this baby can be anything. And when that baby ends up growing up and stealing from you so they can go get drugs, it is heartbreaking at a level I can't even describe. Okay. If chapter 1 is the pain of God emptying my hands, the pain of covenant love, then chapter 2 is the process of covenant love. This is God filling up a cup that he emptied. God dumped out her cup. Now God is going to begin to fill it. But here's what he desires. He desires my understanding in the process of his filling. He wants me to understand he's the one directing my life. And he wants us to experience blessing, but understand that he's the source of it and he has a purpose for it. The greatest sin in the 21st century American church is that we have been blessed immeasurably in America and we don't know why. We think it was so we could have a bigger swimming pool or a third car. Many of us have been incredibly materially blessed and we use it more on ourselves. Let me start off by saying that these are principles of God's blessing in chapter 2. When God is blessing you, here's some basic principles. The first one, I think, is in verses 1 and 2. It begins with our ability to be humble before God. God does not bless arrogant people. He resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So look at verses 1 and 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Boaz is in him is strength. In him is strength. So, my God is king had a relative by the name of in him is strength. A lot turns on the meanings of the words, as you can tell. Verse 2. And the friend, Ruth, the Moabitess, said to the pleasant one, Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain. And she's not talking about corn, she's talking about barley. Okay? After one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now, here's the interesting thing. Verse 1 says that there is hope, bless you, in the family. But verse 2 says the person who doesn't know the person in the family who gives hope is sent out to go and get food. In other words, Ruth doesn't know what Naomi knows. Naomi knows that there are other options here. Why is she not going for them? Because she's bitter. When you believe God's not looking out for you, you don't keep trying harder. You just go, fine. He took everything, then I'm just not having anything. And so she's sitting in the corner, kind of feeling bad about herself. And Ruth says, you know, we got to get some food in here. How about I go out and find someone that will let me glean the corners of the field? Fine, go do it. Look, it begins with our ability to be humble before God. And Ruth has no problem representing humility in the story. I would tell you this, in verse 2, humility can be expressed in letting somebody help us. So I want you to see that in verse 2, Naomi begins to soften. The very first softening point in the story of Naomi up to till now is she says, okay, I'll let you. I'll let you go get what we need. But that's the first softening. In verse 3, let me give you a third principle. When we do our part, God directs the blessing toward us. You don't have to seek the blessing. You just have to do your part in it. And if you'll do your part in it, He'll come after you. So in verse 3, she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to, in him a strength, Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now, did you notice in verse 3? She doesn't know what she's doing. She's stepping out to try and do something positive, but she doesn't have any idea what she's doing. She happens into the field. Now, of course, we got to leave the hand of God in here, right? So in verse 3, when she did her part, God brought her to the place of blessing. It's always easier for God to redirect you when you're already doing something. Sit in your corner and sob and say, I got to meet somebody. You're not going to meet them unless they happen into the corner, okay? So the smartest thing you can do is get busy doing what is good and right, and God can redirect you. I think it's interesting because in verse 4, God often blesses people because of a believer who happens to be close by. So in comes in verse 4, the believer. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. Why did I call him the believer? Because he opens up with, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? He looks at this girl and he thinks that Ruth must be a servant of someone. What I think is interesting is, look at what happens in verses 5 through 9. When God gives, He covers more than the need. So the blessing pours out, and when it's almost like when you start pouring it, it all comes out. So look what happens, verse 6. Servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is a young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. It's not a house. It's a little lean-to shack. It's the middle of the day where people take the siesta time. She's taking the time off to sit underneath the shade. He comes upon and says, who is she? Finds out that she's representing part of his family. He now has an opportunity to bless his family. He can do something. He didn't know that Naomi was back. He doesn't know anything that's happened. And so he's going to catch up on some of the history here. Verse 7, she said, please let me glean, gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She's been sitting in the house for a while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. In other words, get out of the waiting till after they've picked. You can pick alongside them and take whatever you need. This is a way for him to cover a need for his family. And one of the great things is she doesn't understand why this blessing is happening. She's just trying to take care of a problem, and stand in for her friend who is obviously hurting so badly that she can't help herself. I think one of the interesting things is when you get down to verse 10, when we truly understand the goodness of God, we cannot understand why he considers us worthy. And you see it in verse 10. Listen to this. She says, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner? This is interesting because she is of a foreign people, but she exudes a humility that is an attractive humility. I can't believe you would even pay attention to me. I'm just a Moabitess. What she doesn't know is he is now supplying also for his family. Now, when you get to verse 11, here's another principle. God blesses those who are faithfully dedicated to do what he wants them to be doing. So in verse 11, Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. And this is the first time Boaz reveals he's understanding more than he appeared to be understanding. And how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. He said, I've seen your sacrifice and I've heard your whole story in the background, and I got to tell you something. I'm really impressed with what I've heard. You get down to verse 11 and verse 12, and God blesses the people who act in faith, right? So verse 12, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. I think what's interesting is she's a thankful person. One of the people that I will tell you this, God loves to bless thankful people. It's not only humble people, it's thankful people. People, you know what a joy it is to do something nice to somebody who really appreciates it? How many of you know how unjoyful it is to do something for somebody who doesn't appreciate it? Okay? Verse 14, I think what's interesting is that when you get to the last part of this, you know, if you drop from 14 all the way down through the rest of the passage, you come to the conclusion that God's object in blessing is to get our attention and keep it on him. So look what he does in 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here that you may eat the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. You're all excited about that meal, right? Bread and vinegar. Actually, it's a pretty decent meal for a midday when it's really hot out. And she sat beside the reapers, and he served her beside the reapers. He served her roasted grain, and she ate, and she was satisfied and had some left. It's roasted barley dipped in vinegar. It's actually quite good. I know it doesn't sound good, but it is. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Why did he say that? Because she's a Moabitess. There's a lot of prejudice out in that field, but he doesn't have it. And although she is able to speak the Hebrew language, it's clear, she has learned to do so, she probably speaks it with an accent. She's an immigrant, and they're not the most immigrant-friendly people. And what's interesting is it says, also, you shall purposely pull out from her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean it, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. That sounds funny, but when you take barley, you actually pick it, and then you actually beat it, and then you actually break up the barley, and then it's eventually ground. Okay, so she's processing what she has picked. And she had about an ephah of barley. She took it and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw that what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed. Now that's the first positive statement she's given in the whole book. This is the first time she said anything nice about people. I think you're almost halfway through the book, and by now you should feel like, lady, you really have a chip on your shoulder, but don't forget what she's lost. She's lost everything that matters to her. I don't know if you know what that feels like, but this is the person whose whole family dies in the car accident, but them. She totally has her world ripped apart. What I think is interesting is Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." What's interesting is Naomi recognizes who Boaz is. But that's not the surprising part. She, for the first time, acknowledges she does have an alternative to sitting there and dying slowly. There are relatives. Oh, there are relatives? Why didn't you tell me there were relatives? Now, what's interesting is after she tells him about Boaz and they're talking back and forth, verse 21, then Ruth the Moabitess said, "Furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out." Now, this is the second positive statement. It is good that you go out with his maids so that others do not fall upon you in another field. Apparently, she's drop dead gorgeous, and her mother-in-law's afraid that she's going to be out there undefended. She's a Moabite. Exactly who does she yell to? It's pretty easy for the person who's the foreigner to get kind of singled out. So she says, "This is really good. I feel good about you going out there. I feel like you're safe out there." What's interesting to me is that's the first tender thing she says to Ruth. Like, it's almost starting to spark inside of her, I do care about you. What you're seeing is God slowly brings blessing to first Ruth and then to Naomi to help fan the flames and wake her up. God is not against you. He's not trying to harm you. He has a future for you, but he can't get you there until he ends your past, because you're clinging to a set of things and he wants you over here doing this. So finally it says, Naomi said, verse 22, to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good." Verse 23, so she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest. And the wheat harvest, which, by the way, is short, comes a little bit later than the barley harvest, and you have a lot less wheat than you have barley. And she lived there with her mother-in-law. Okay, so as Act 2 closes, Act 1 was about the pain of emptying my hands, the pain of covenant love. But Act 2 really is about the process of covenant love. What is God trying to do? He's trying to work with Naomi to become pleasant, to go from being bitter to being pleasant. In other words, to be revived and to be... Now, what's interesting is the person who came from the foreign people who did not know God is the one who's representing God in the place. The one who's doing right is the Moabitess. The one who's doing wrong is the Israelite. And now you have Boaz, and he comes into the story, and what you see is a redeemer.